Hello and welcome back to Supreme Court Now. My name is Luis Valledo, and before we get into the cases of November 3rd, 2020, I'd like to apologize and put a small disclaimer of why it is November 13th and I'm doing cases from 10 days ago. As you know, November 3rd was election day, and since then I have been pretty busy. I'm taking an American politics class called Political Parties and Elections, so I'm sure you could imagine how enthralled I have been in that class and just this election overall. But now that the election is over, um, I'll have more time to work on my video. So with that, let's get into the two cases the Supreme Court looked at on November 3rd. They were Jones versus Mississippi and Borden versus the United States. Jones versus Mississippi. So for this case, we got to look back to 2004 when the defendant, Brett Jones, was 15 years old. He was found guilty of killing his grandfather, whom he stabbed 8 times in the chest. He was tried and sentenced in Lee County, Mississippi, where he was charged with capital murder and given life in prison with no possibility of parole. Since then, Jones has been in prison. So now let's look to 2012 when the Supreme Court ruled on Miller versus Alabama. Miller versus Alabama was consolidated with Jackson v. Hobbs, and the reason we should look at this case is because both of the defendants were juvenile boys who had similar cases to Jones. They were sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole while they were under the age of 18. The first defendant, Evan Miller, robbed and then beat his neighbor inside of his trailer and then proceeded to light the trailer on fire. And in Alabama, he was given life in prison with no parole. Meanwhile, Contrell Jackson from Arkansas did not commit the crime, but Arkansas prosecutors found him guilty of capital murder as well. So Jackson was in the vicinity of a video store, and the store was robbed, the clerk was shot and killed, and it's just wrong place, wrong time, and he got charged for the crime. And that kind of rhymed a little bit. And so the reason we're looking at this case is because the Supreme Court ruled in favor of Jackson and Miller. Jones's defense sees this as, well, if it's unconstitutional to put these boys in prison for life with no possibility of parole, then Jones should have a pretty easy appeal since the Supreme Court just decided that juveniles cannot be sentenced to life in prison without parole. So after this Supreme Court case, the Mississippi State Supreme Court ordered that Lee County Circuit Court, which is where Jones was arrested back in 2004, to hold a rehearing for Jones's case. However, because now Jones is 23, when the court reheard his case, he was once again sentenced to life in prison with no chance of parole. Jones appealed the decision, but his appeal was denied. And so Jones remains incarcerated. So now we got to jump another 4 years to 2016 in the case of Montgomery versus Louisiana, another Supreme Court case that Jones's defense cited in attempt of getting his release. In Montgomery v. Louisiana, the Supreme Court ruled that cases regarding juveniles and life sentence are retroactive, meaning that they would take effect from a past date. So in Jones's case, if his case is considered retroactive, right, he could be tried again as a 15-year-old and not a 23-year-old, which would give the state of Mississippi a reason to rehear his case and refute the life sentence. Because in fact, Miller versus Alabama stated plain and clear, it's unconstitutional to give a juvenile life in prison without parole. However, there is a little catch for Jones because in Montgomery versus Louisiana, the Supreme Court did rule that cases for juvenile are retroactive, but there was a small except in the clause. And so the clause stated that the retroactive mandate applies for all juveniles except for, quote, those whose crime reflect permanent incorrigibility, end quote. And incorrigibility basically means a person or an action that cannot be changed. It'll always be the way it is. So I think from here you can see where the case is going to go. The Supreme Court is going to have to see, is murder as a juvenile considered an incorrigible act? If so, Jones's case isn't retroactive, and thus he'll remain incarcerated. But if the judge decides that it's not incorrigible, and yes, murder is a horrible crime, but he committed it when he was 15, he could change, he can be a different person, come back and adapt and contribute to our society. His case could be reheard in the state of Mississippi, and his life sentence with no parole could be dialed down or could be taken away altogether. So we will have to wait and see. So now we'll look on to Borden versus United States. Charles Borden Jr. pled guilty to a possession of a firearm as a felon during a traffic stop in Tennessee. Borden had already had 3 previous aggravated assault cases in Tennessee prior to his most recent arrest. So during the trial, the court gave him 9 years and 7 months. They tried to throw the book at him and cited the Armed Career Criminal Act, which states that the use of carrying a firearm or a knife or a destructive device would be punishable by imprisonment if committed by an adult that has shown the use of physical force against another person. So Borden objects to the sentence, arguing that in just one of his previous assaults, it was not considered a crime of violence, which under the U.S. sentencing guidelines, a crime of violence is murder, voluntary manslaughter, kidnapping, aggravated assault, forcible sex, robbery, arson, extortion, or the unlawful possession of a firearm. And because it was simply a reckless aggravated assault and not an aggravated assault, he should not be tried under the Armed Career Criminal Act. Borden's defense also noted that in 2017, the United States versus Verweebe in the 6th Circuit of Appeals in Cincinnati, Ohio, ruled that reckless aggravated assault is a crime of violence, and they're kind of tacking this on to all the other crimes that we mentioned before under U.S. Law Code 924, subsection B, subsection 1. Now, Borden argues that if the prosecutors were to use this case, this U.S. versus Verweebe case, it'd be a violation of the due process, only because that case was not decided until 6 months after Borden's arrest. So the Supreme Court is going to see a similar issue to the case we talked about before, Jones versus Mississippi, which is, does a law that is passed after an arrest have relevance over crimes that happened before the law was passed? I think this could actually be a pretty serious case if it rules one way or another. If the court would rule in favor of Borden and not cite his previous reckless aggravated assault as a violent crime, I don't think it would change much. One, because he has a pretty bad track record, and if we think back to the guidelines that I mentioned earlier, unlawful possession of a weapon was in one of the crimes that's considered a violent crime. So either way, Borden will still likely face a lot of time behind bars, but what the Supreme Court case could decide is just in general, if a law is passed after you're arrested or detained, can it pertain to you? So I think on a grander scale, and this really hasn't come up, but if we think about all the people who have been incarcerated for marijuana cases, and now marijuana is legal in some states, let's say that the new president legalizes it in the entire country. Well, are we going to release all the prisoners who broke the law at the time they were arrested because now there's a new law that happened after? So that's why I'm pretty excited to see how this case will go. I think it can have really a lot of underlying effects just about on everybody. So with that, those are all of the cases for November 3rd. Thank you guys for watching. If you'd like to watch other videos, make sure to click my channel. And if you like this, make sure to stay tuned because I will be covering all of the cases that the Supreme Court covers during the 2020 through 2021 term. So without further ado, adios.